Hi everyone, today in this tutorial we're going to be talking about the AP Poetry Analysis essay. So far in class together we've practiced the prose analysis, we've practiced the open-ended free response, so this will be the last one that we go over together. Although I think in terms of structuring your thesis and your outline to respond to the prompt, a lot of this could fit in well with prose analysis, so keep that in mind if you have found that challenging as you watch today. So just a few general pieces of information. The poetry analysis will always be the first essay prompt, but you don't have to respond in order. So that will always be the first one that shows up. For some people, that feels very intimidating. It could be from any era or style of poetry. Some prompts will ask you just to analyze one poem. Some will ask you to compare two poems. They will often have a common theme or topic or subject, but ask you how the style and structure of it shows that same subject in a different way. So a few steps to keep in mind in order to succeed on this type of essay. First, you want to read and annotate the prompt. Then you read and annotate the poem and the title. That's so easy to overlook, but it can give you so much good information. And then outline briefly before you write. So for the first step, reading and annotating the prompt, few things to look for in the prompt. There will be a lot of direction words and context, so each prompt will include the purpose you are expected to address in your analysis. So for example, it might ask you to show how the poetic devices help to convey the speaker's complex attitude toward desire. A lot of times people do a good job of identifying literary devices, but not of showing how those contribute to the specific purpose the prompt is asking you for. And that purpose really should be the main focus of your essay in order to respond to the prompt. Don't skip over the context in the prompt itself. It will give you key things about maybe where the poet is from, when it was written, and that can help a lot. It's not the end of the world if you don't know everything about that poet, but it will affect your analysis if you ignore clues that are already given to you. And then each prompt will include suggested literary devices for you to analyze and use in your poem. You're not required to use those literary devices, but I personally highly recommend it unless something stands out immediately to you. If the people who wrote the prompt already identified certain literary devices, that means that they know that those are in the poem and they know that they can help answer the prompt. So unless there's something else that you're dying to talk about that you see right away, don't spend time making it harder on yourself. You don't get any extra points. You don't score any higher for coming up with a literary device that they didn't include in the prompt. Exactly. So same thing. There's no penalty for just going with what they have in the prompt. There is a time and a place to be creative and really dive deep into your own thinking. When you have 40 minutes to write an essay, it's really just not the time for that. So when you read and annotate the poem as well as the title, a few things to look for. Clues about who the speaker or the subject of the poem is in the title. So let me go back to that just for a second. A lot of times, especially in older British poetry, poems will start with to so-and-so or on this. So when it's to so-and-so, you know exactly who the speaker is speaking to. If it's on something, then you know kind of what the topic is. So those are key things to look for. A few years ago, the AP poetry prompt was all about a juggler, and the poem itself wasn't clear about that, but the title was The Juggler. So my students who skipped over that title had a much tougher time understanding what was going on. You also want to look for examples of the suggested literary devices from the prompt. So as you read, I think following the devices in the prompt lifts a burden off of you, where you're no longer responsible for looking for every single little thing, just the things that stand out immediately, as well as the suggested literary devices. You also want to be looking for main ideas of the poem. Not every single line is going to click for you right away, but doing a quick read through the first time, what sticks out to you? What's the main idea? What is the poem trying to get at? And like I mentioned, any other literary devices that jump out right away. If there's a very strong rhyming pattern or metrical scheme or an image that keeps coming up over and over, anything that immediately strikes you. Next part, outlining and writing. I recommend that people only very briefly outline. I'd say 3 to 5 minutes max, because by the time you have read the poem, which will probably take at least 5 minutes to work through, and then if you outline for 5 minutes, that's all good prep, but it really only leaves you 30 minutes to write. So your outline should mostly be just kind of figuring out main topics, main examples, not elaborating too much further. So a few things to keep in mind for what to write as you outline and then as you develop that more fully into your essay. Your introduction really needs to focus on a very clear thesis. So we'll talk more about what that looks like and how to create one based on a given prompt. But that's more important than having an elaborate opening. If you're able to quickly think of a strong hook, a very nice, elegant opening to your essay, go for it. Otherwise, a clear thesis is more beneficial than spending all your brain power and all your time on a very elaborate opening. And then double check that your thesis and your outline clearly respond to the entire prompt. If you just get through the intro paragraph and realize you need to add in something to address the prompt, it's not too late. If you've written your whole essay, then it might be tougher to add that in. In the body of your essay, you want to include lots of evidence and clear analysis, making sure that every paragraph connects to your thesis, which should be responding to your prompt. You also want to be responding to the so what question, meaning that if somebody asks, okay, well, so what if they have this rhyme pattern, you've explained why it is significant, why it changes the subject or the mood or the attitude of the poem. And then always assume that the poet wants to paint a picture and interest the reader. Assume that every poet wants to do that. There are a lot of times where people write an essay saying that the purpose of this was to portray an image or paint a picture or interest the reader or attract the audience. Those are very, very surface level motivations for poets. Assume that everybody wants to do that and then dig deeper into what's the bigger purpose, what's the commentary that they're trying to make, what is the main idea that they're trying to convey. For the conclusion, really only focus on a brief conclusion if you have time, all right? A couple sentences is sufficient. It is good to have something rather than nothing, but it's better to spend more of your energy on the body paragraphs, which will help respond to the prompt, than on the conclusion itself. And this should absolutely not be the first time you are explaining the purpose of your essay, the purpose of these literary devices. A lot of times people go all of these paragraphs not explaining the point of the literary devices they've chosen, briefly touching on it here. That's just not enough. It's good to talk about it in the conclusion, but it's really important that that's not the first time. So as we talk about thesis statements, we're going to look at a few examples, one that is a little bit stronger and one that is a little bit weaker, right? So the stronger one says, this poem's use of caesura, imagery, and an irregular metrical pattern all contribute to the vision of a complex, tense father-son relationship by showing interrupted thoughts and inconsistency between speakers. This thesis statement is very strong, which will not only benefit you in your score, but it also gives you a much clearer direction for the rest of your essay. This thesis has outlined 3 specific things that they're going to touch on from evidence in the poem. It has said what they do, and it has shown how they do that. Weaker thesis statement, which as a grader, from my perspective, is not strong because it doesn't really tell me anything. It's just rephrasing the prompt. And for you as the writer is also weaker because you don't really know where to go from this. Is this poem uses many literary devices which all contribute to the purpose of the poem. Another way to think about it, if you're not really sure if your thesis statement could be stronger or if it's good yet, this thesis statement here really applies to this one poem. This thesis statement here pretty much applies to every poem ever written, so it doesn't really help you explain your thoughts on this specific poem or specific 2 poems. So a template that I like to keep in mind for how to come up with a thesis statement for this type of prompt looks a little something like this. So the poem's use of blank, blank, and blank, so all 3 literary devices, all contribute to, and then you talk a little bit about what the main issue or the topic of the prompt is, that will usually be provided, and then by showing, and then the main effect of the literary devices. So how do these literary devices get you here? So if we look at that same kind of color-coded pattern from the stronger thesis statement that we looked at earlier, it would be this poem's use of caesura, imagery, and an irregular metrical pattern all contribute to the vision of a complex tense father-son relationship by showing interrupted thoughts and inconsistency between speakers. So this thesis statement has set us up for success because we have specifics, we have what they do, and we have how they do it. And then from there, we're able to make a very solid outline for ourselves. So we see that because our first literary device that we mentioned in the thesis is caesura, we want to go in order of our thesis. So our first body paragraph is going to include examples of caesura, an analysis of the effect of caesura, and how that contributes to the father-son relationship. Our next body paragraph is going to do pretty much the same thing but with imagery. So it will provide examples of imagery, it will analyze the effect of the imagery, and explain how that imagery contributes to the father-son relationship. And then lastly, the third paragraph or third body paragraph would show examples of the metrical pattern, analysis of how that affects the poem, and how that contributes to the complex and tense father-son relationship. And when we talk about outlining briefly, this is sufficient because you should already have examples underlined or circled or something in your copy of the poem. You don't need to rewrite them, that's a waste of time. Maybe a couple words added for analysis and how it contributes, but just keeping this as kind of your check mark in your outline of all the things that you need to cover. Last part, rereading and revising. When you're done writing, reread your work to make sure all your ideas are together. The revision piece becomes more complicated when you have all three essays at once because it's not as clear if you should spend time revising or if you should just move on to the next one. But it's really important to at least reread the prompt to double check that you took care of everything that you need to, reread your thesis to make sure it responds to the prompt, and reread your essay to make sure each paragraph responds to the thesis. So these are all really connected. So if you miss something in the prompt, you're going to miss it in your essay. If you miss something in the thesis, obviously you'll miss it in the essay. And sometimes the thesis is great, but the essay doesn't follow up. So it's important to make sure all of those are properly integrated. So if we look at an example together, and there are a lot of links in here, so in the information about this video, I'll put the link to the slideshow as a whole so that you're able to follow up on those links as desired. So this would be an example of a poetry prompt. This is from the 2012 AP exam. And the prompt says, in the following poem by Sir Philip Sidney, 1554 to 1586, the speaker addresses the subject of desire. Read the poem carefully, then write a well-developed essay in which you analyze how poetic devices help to convey the speaker's complex attitude toward desire. Okay. So like we mentioned, a few things to keep in mind. We have the title, Thou Blind Man's Mark. We want to keep that in mind as we read through. Oftentimes in older poems, the title just by default is the beginning of the poem, so we see that here. We know a little bit about the poet here. We see Sir, which can help us guess that he is most likely a British poet. We see the time in which it was written. Then we see that we want to use our analysis of these devices to show how the speaker feels about desire. Okay. This prompt does make one exception in that it does not necessarily give you literary devices to look for, but it is a briefer poem. So as you look at it, you can immediately see that there is some kind of regularity with the rhyme. We see a lot of words at the end of the lines that look the same. So we can use that as a start. Also, don't forget to look at these footnotes. They are always very helpful. Even if you think you know the word, like mark and hire, we use those words today, but we use them very differently than these definitions here. So take a look through this together in class next week. We'll take a look at practicing writing a thesis and an outline based on this, but feel free to get a head start if you want more practice. I also wanted to show you an example of a prompt that would have you compare two poems. This is from the 2008 AP exam. And the prompt says, in the two poems below, Keats and Longfellow reflect on similar concerns. Read the poems carefully, Then write an essay in which you compare and contrast the two poems, analyzing the poetic techniques each writer uses to explore his particular situation. So for this one, it's a lot of important things to keep in mind. I know that we are trying to save time and we're trying to skip over things that are unnecessary, but don't skip over dates and things like that, okay? That's important. So it's important to see that this one came first, so this is most likely a response to the first one. It's important to see that they are from relatively the same time period, so we know that if there are any differences in style and structure, it's not really indicative of the times so much as the author. That's important to keep in mind as well. You can even see the way it's structured very quickly. So here we see that we have one line and then another one indented, one line and then another one indented, and then here we have one line and then three indented, so that can give us a good indication of the rhyming pattern to come. We'll also take a look at this one together, but do take some time to read through it. Write down your initial thoughts so that we can have an easier discussion in class. And when you're in doubt, you're still stuck after all that, just find examples of the literary devices asked for, come up with a way they achieve the purpose in the prompt, and just explain that connection. Sometimes it's going to feel like you're making a bit of a stretch. Sometimes it's going to feel like, oh, I don't know if this is the right answer. If you explain it and you include evidence, it might not be the best answer, but it'll still be a right answer. And so when I upload these slides to the information in the video, feel free to click here for all the AP Central resources. So I've provided a few examples in the past two slides of old prompts, as well as the guidelines of how those were scored, just so that you can kind of see that for reference. But if you want to look up any other ones from past years, this would really be the website to go to. So fill in anything that you need to in your notes, give those prompts another look over, and then we'll talk together in class.